Well, welcome back, everyone. We're in the final stretch of the workshop here. We're going to finish up with a discussion on the rules for 2022 challenge, including answering some of the questions that we had on the first day about what are the key rules that some teams may have some questions on or some interpretation, uh, you know, differences and things like that. And so I'll talk through some of that as well. And then we'll end the day with how to drive a cross-country race. And then we'll be done for the day. So with that, let's get started. Again, if you have any questions at all, feel free and type them into the chat or the Q&A as you guys have been doing already. And then, of course, after the workshop, you're free to email Dr. Marks, me, Chris, anyone else, if you have any questions. Okay, starting the rules, the most important thing is to know that there are regular event updates that get issued for rules that are periodically clarified or amended. And so what you'll see as we go along is you'll get event updates that talk about specific road rules. There are certain policies and procedures that we have for a road race, just like we have policies and procedures for a closed track race. And so we will be issuing those via event updates. And then as you provide any questions or concerns about the rules, if we find them to be generally applicable to other solar car teams, we will issue that as well as in an event update. And so anything that we issue in an event update is binding just as much as the rules are binding per Rule 29. So you want to make sure that you're signed up for the intent to race, that you would get these event updates, and that you regularly check our event update section in our webpage for that information. For the rules, we ask that you keep copies of these rules throughout your workshop. I know that when we set up our workshop, and that's a picture of that there in Walnut, is that we would keep multiple sets of the rules throughout the workshop so that it could be easily accessible. Sometimes you're doing a particular design and implementation, and you want to look up and say, was there a particular rule on that we want to make sure we're compliant with? We want to have those around. And treat the rules as part of the engineering lifecycle. And so, as a professional engineer now, we treat every project via this engineering lifecycle where you have a set of requirements about describing what the project is supposed to do. You design it, then you implement it, and then you verify what you implemented. So in a solar car context, the rules are your requirements. Your solar car must meet those rules. And then you would start designing your car, maybe on AutoCAD or on some type of CAD software, or just even drawing it out. Then the next thing you want to do before you get to implementation is look at your design and compare that against the requirements. Does it meet all the requirements? If it does, move on to implement. And when you implement something, sometimes there's little tweaks that you make that are deviating from the design. And so you want to verify that you meet the requirements still. And then at the very end, once you've finished building your car and you've done all these spot checks of your design and implementation, you'll want to go through the rules again at the very end to make sure everything's checked off. And the way you might want to do that is to actually run through our scrutineering checklist where we check for your vehicle and make sure that they comply with the requirements. Same here, you could actually go and do a formal verification and show that your vehicle meets the rules. We recommend that you don't read it, the rules all in one sitting. There's a lot of information there, and you want to take time to reread sections of the rules. And don't look at other cars' designs and assume it complies with the rules. Just like there were some pictures that I used as examples, that were compliant when they raced, but are no longer compliant. Likewise, if you're looking at other designs, they may not be compliant anymore. And so you want to make sure that your car is compliant. We have very few rules that are grandfathered in now. And so for the most part, you'll need to comply the rules unless you have an approved waiver. Just a note, in this presentation, I have highlighted any changes from the previous rules in blue, in this bright blue color. And so I'll highlight those things. With regard to registration, we do require that you submit your registration document, sort of a Word document, and associated drawings and the registration fee by March 1st. And so you see a list of required supplemental information here. One of the key things is that many teams don't submit their mechanical drawings with their crush zones identified. And so we ask that you take a special note of that and say, specifically call it out. As Brian shared with his team, he actually colored the crush zone to show which frame structures are part of the crush zone. That's another way to do it. But we really need to know that you've thought through the crush zone requirements and you can show how that applies in your car. And there's a lot of other supplemental information that we want from you to help you get an early read on whether or not you comply with the requirements. Another big part of the rule is that this is a high school competition. So it's the intent that high school students design and construct their solar car. And so there are often times in which a college might sort of get rid of their old parts and they make them available at low or no cost. But in the sense of actual solar car components, that would not be allowed in the sense of a university team might be able to donate you the plug for a body structure, but you would be responsible for creating the actual body structure for your car. We want to see that you've actually built it. And so you can't reuse another portion's frame, for example. So you can't go and buy like an ATV front end or a golf cart front end and just install it, right? You have to re-engineer those parts and to fit your application. So not to say that you can't use off-the-shelf components, motors, controllers, and wheels and hubs and things like that, but you'll want to put some thought into creating your solar car. And hey, that's the fun part of it. We do split up our solar cars into different divisions, and we have classic and advanced classic divisions for more of the entry-level vehicles, and then we have a more advanced division for some of the higher cost items there. As you know, we also have an electric solar power division, which is a 2-passenger vehicle, and then a cruiser division, which is a 4-passenger vehicle. Some of the minor updates that we've made to the rules for 2022 is just to clarify that there is no rear wheel steering. We've basically implicitly prohibited it in the past because we required that you have a reverse strike configuration, and so you would only have a single wheel in the back. But just to be explicit, we don't allow for rear wheel steering. We made a clarification on fasteners. We originally had, I think, 1 thread showing as the standard, and then we found out that the industry standard was to have 2 threads showing for the nylon locking nuts, and so we've adopted that industry standard. And then the biggest change to this part is the waivers. We recognize that in various designs, there are assumptions that are made in the rules about a tubular frame. And so if you weren't making a tubular frame, for example, some of these would be like, how does this rule apply? And so we would we generalize the waiver process to say, if the rule has a different interpretation for your car because the way you built your car, then you would want to submit a waiver for that rule just so that you get some type of review and approval for that. Just like I shared earlier, you want to submit that waiver request to Dr. Marks with the appropriate supporting information. So for example, if you're trying to use a different dimension for your roll bar, then you'll want to provide the engineering analysis that your equivalent design would have the same strength as what we require. There's a question that says, can the same school or group use the same car in consecutive years? And yes, the original car was built by solar car students and high school students, and so the current group of students do not have to be the ones that built that car. However, one thing of caution is we will be asking you to explain the engineering decisions that were made, and explain how the car works. And so even though the team didn't build it, you definitely want to be continuing to pass along that, I guess, tribal information to upcoming teams that take over that solar car. The biggest question that we have is with roll cage, crush zone, and roll bar. And I spent a lot of time on this in the building the vehicle frame section. So I just want to bring this up again, but I want to show you this diagram again, right? That namely, we are looking for a roll cage and a crush zone that is able to encompass the entire driver. And so we showed examples of that. And well, if you have questions about whether or not your design appropriately meets our roll cage and crush zone structure rules, then please submit it to Dr. Marks and to us so that we can help you clarify whether or not it meets the rules. And as I shared at the introduction, certainly because of all the questions that teams have had, we are still continuing to relook and look at ways to better clarify our intent for the roll cage, roll bar, and crush zone. But ultimately, what we're looking for is appropriate driver protection in case of impact, and having a rigid area inside for the roll cage and a less rigid area on the outside as a crush zone that can take some impact. With regard to the electrical section of the rules, some of the key areas to note is the need for measuring the battery at 5 kilowatt hours at a 20-hour discharge rate for lead acid batteries, and then of course at the 1C rate for lithium-based chemistries. We also talked about the importance of having locking washers or some type of locking component on your battery terminals, and that is part of the rule, and so we will be verifying that during scrutineering and throughout the race. We talk about having appropriately sized fuse, and so that's something that gets some teams sometimes, is that they don't size their main fuse appropriately. Some teams actually undersize their main fuse, and they look and say, well, I'm going to get the main fuse to be 125% of the expected continuous current. And then in some type of hill or in some type of situation, where you might have a spike in current, it could actually blow that fuse. And so you want the fuse to be sized to the expected peak current, something that you might get to, but not on an often enough basis. And that it has to be in a separate enclosure. Okay. Other areas of the rules, your battery compartment cannot vent. We require ventilation for your batteries, but it can't vent into the driver compartment, which also means that you can't cut a hole and vent. You can't cut a hole towards the driver and then vent it out away from the driver. We have to have a solid wall between the battery box and the driver. And then, of course, can't locate it in the front of the vehicle, as I mentioned. A new rule for 2022 is that there's no high voltage wiring allowed in the driver compartment. And that's associated with our relay contactor disconnect switch rule, which I'll cover next. But because we've basically driven to a relay contactor requirement, then there's really no reason to have high voltage wiring in the driver compartment, and it improves the safety so that the driver can't accidentally get shocked if there was some type of break in that wiring. Okay. And then likewise, just like in batteries, we do require a lock washer for the high voltage connections. Okay, let's talk about disconnect switches and our new rules essentially with regard to relays and contactors. Essentially, we still rely on having two sets of two actuators or switches, right? That basically push-pull buttons that either the driver can operate or someone external to the solar car can operate. So there's the two sets, the internal and external sets of switches. But because we're relying on relays, the relays can then, you could choose to have one set of relays for the motor and for the array disconnect. And so instead of having the switch actually break the connection, the switch will operate a relay and contactor that is outside of the driver compartment that can then break the circuit. And then the switch is just used to engage or disengage that relay. So a bit of details, what that looks like. It means that you have two sets of two control switches that are in your system. The internal or driver disconnect, and then your external disconnect for the array and for the motor. And then those would drive an array contactor and a motor contactor. So you can simplify your circuitry a little bit because you no longer need to have two switches that are handling the high voltage, right? In this case, these switches could be operated by the low voltage cabling and use the relay to break that contactor. And so we think that this will be a great improvement to safety. All these contactors and fuses are in an enclosure, so in case anything blows up, it is away from the driver. Okay. As we shared in our braking portion, we no longer allow for linking of the pedals together. And so pedals all the way up to the master cylinder to the brake calipers are all independent. And so that's a new change for 2022. With regard to lights and horn, they're pretty standard requirements. However, some teams get confused as to our requirements because they want to implement the way that traditional regular vehicles are. So in our rules, we require separate turn signals from the brake indicators, and that the turn signals or turn indicators are colored amber, and that the stop lights are colored red. And so that essentially mandates that you have 6 total lights, right? You have your front left, front right, rear left, rear right turn indicators, and then you have your stoplights. You typically put 2. I suppose you can put one long one, and so maybe you have 5 lights, but certainly you don't want to combine your rear stoplights with your rear indicators because they're of different colors. Okay. The audible warning or horn, we do require that you put it as far front as possible for 2 reasons. One is to let the cars in front be able to hear that you're coming up ahead. And then second is to get it out of the driver compartment so that the driver isn't having to hear it every time. It's less important on a track race because you'll have your entire traveling convoy with horns and lights, but it is still required and we will still check for that. Okay, with regard to driver safety, one of the key rules that teams have had issues with is how to mount it on their solar car. We see a lot of solar cars mount their shoulder harness, especially up behind and above their shoulder. And that's not the way these 5-point harnesses are designed. They are designed to be mounted behind and bottom below the shoulder so that the strap goes over your shoulder and down. When you mount the shoulder harness up above, behind and above you, then there's a lot of slack, and when there's some type of impact, the driver could be bumped up like that and be loose. And so we require that you mount your shoulder belt attached per the manufacturer's instructions, but that really means that you got to mount that shoulder belt below the driver's shoulder. Okay. We have a set of rules for the electric solar powered car. Of course, you can take a look at that for yourself. I'd like to focus in on one aspect of this is a road race. So in a track race, you have a specific area that you mount your solar charging station, and that stays there for the entire period of the race. On a road race, that charging station needs to be mounted on a support trailer that travels with you. Another thing to consider as you run a road race as an electric solar powered car is that if you end up putting the charging station separate from your actual car trailer, then that solar charging station can't be traveling with the convoy. There are limits to the length of the convoy. The convoy needs to have your lead vehicle, your solar car, and your chase vehicle. And then further back is one additional chase vehicle. But your main convoy is 3 vehicles, lead, solar, and chase, and they can all travel closely together. We don't allow for 2 trailers to be part of the same convoy. So you can't use, let's say, an enclosed trailer for a lead vehicle and an open trailer for a chase vehicle, or vice versa. You can't swap back and forth. It makes the convoy too long, and it makes it difficult for other passing traffic to get by you. And so we require that you only have 1 trailer type vehicle in your convoy. But that means that if you are installing a solar charging station separate from your car trailer, it will just be traveling outside of your convoy, and you can make arrangements to radio or call them to meet you at a particular place so that you can do a battery swap and charge your batteries. Okay. And then we're excited about the cruiser division and what's going to happen. Glad to have an entry last year, and we're looking forward to seeing additional entries coming. And so there are specific rules for that. No gotchas quite yet because it's a new division. And so that's pretty much the rules and some of the key gotchas for various teams.